start. Yes, thank you, Siva.
Okay then. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. In fact, this presentation is mainly because of Jeanette's idea that she said. I have been arguing every time that whether to have independent scripts or if they are not there, how do we handle? How do we protect the indigenous communities, indigenous language and the knowledge? So basically, I would be looking at, because when I'm talking about language is not aloof. It is a part of a culture and it is also part of the surrounding nature and the livelihoods and all those things that are connected with it. That's where I try to problematize the link between the language, cultural knowledge, and the nature. And I'm also trying to understand the factors that lie behind the way in which oral cultures survived or survive. When I'm talking about oral cultures, they're basically unwritten languages. And or basically they have only oral traditions. So how do they sustain is one thing that we need to look at. And why they are disappearing is also an important aspect to look at it. And under these circumstances, how do we digitalize or digitize the oral cultures which do not have a script? So that is the problem, and also a dilemma for us. And also another thing is, there are also problems with regard to digitizing the indigenous and minority languages, even if one or two of them have a script. But then the script is designed or written by somebody else, and the community it may not be using it. And how do we reckon with it is also an important issue that we need to keep in mind. And what is important for all of us is that we have been discussing for the past couple of years is we need to work on sustaining the indigenous and minority languages. And we also need to promote those languages for education purposes, because education at the other time is very important aspect understand. So what is that we find is there is always an imminent threat to indigenous languages. When I'm saying imminent threat, it is also because there are the dominant cultures, dominant languages, they become a threat to the survival of the indigenous languages. It was not the case in the past, but it is much more today. In fact, even some of the dominant languages are also threatened by languages like English, which are being used. Though now there is a decline in the usage in social media of those, because regional languages are gaining popularity. So we need to understand the reasons and causes for the threat for the indigenous languages. And in fact, even when we are talking about indigenous languages, the dominant indigenous groups may have better chances of sustaining themselves. But what happens to the communities or cultures which have a very small groups? What happens to their languages? What happens to their knowledge? And what happens to their culture? How can they be sustained? Because we need to talk about the distinction in terms of the language communities or the speech communities. The size of them also matters. So we need to understand the inherent strengths for the continued sustenance of such kind of languages or such kind of cultures, because even if they are small, if they are able to withstand, there must be some inherent strength that need to be taken into account. And in a way, what I am trying to talk about is, what makes the non-written language communities survive despite the onslaught of the dominant cultures and dominant languages. The dominant cultures always try to, influence or even push their cultural understanding. It's almost like a ethnocentric bias that is thrust on these communities, and sometimes they are able to withstand, sometimes they succumb to it. So, how do they survive? In spite of the push of the dominant cultures and languages. This is one aspect that we need to keep in mind. Can we use, because the point I'm trying to make is, can we use the same factors that allowed them to sustain themselves? If we can use the same factors to protect those languages, that may be a better way of looking at protecting such languages, because they had certain inherent strengths. If we can understand those inherent strengths, then we can use those inherent strengths to protect those languages. So, is it possible for us to find the ways to digitize the oral or unwritten language and cultures? See, if you have a script, you can digitize. But if you don't have a script, how do we digitize those cultures and those languages? They are not written. So we need to ponder over these issues in order to find some solutions to them. Because the distinction I'm trying to make is the cultures that, or the languages that have a script, languages that are not unwritten and written languages. So how do we sustain the languages which do not have a script, the oral cultures? So this is what we need to think much more carefully. Now, I'm trying to, as I mentioned, that we need to understand the linkages between the knowledge, culture, and language. In fact, if you really look at any cultural heritage includes the many things into that. And knowledge that they possess surrounding their nature and regarding many other aspects that control or guide them, they are handed down through a process of education. That is, from one generation to the next generation, the way they are passed on, that itself is a process of education that involves. And in that process of education, of transmitting the cultural heritage and cultural knowledge, it is the language that plays a very important role, and that we need to understand. The process of this transmission, which is a process of education, in which language is an important one, because the language contains certain, because specific idioms, specific words depicting many other aspects are not expressible in other languages. And that is where language plays an important role in the process of this cultural heritage or knowledge transmission. Now, it doesn't mean knowledge is static. Knowledge is always dynamic, and knowledge survives, because one thing what we need to remember is, so long as the knowledge is able to meet the needs of the communities, it will survive. That means it is serving the purpose for which the knowledge was generated. The moment that knowledge is not able to serve, which means the basis for that knowledge has changed. When the basis of the knowledge has changed, then it will cease to serve the purpose. So we must understand the link between knowledge and the needs that it needs, and how it changes. When the other kind of interventions may take place, then knowledge becomes problematic there for them. Because, for example, somebody is displaced from a place and moves to a new place where the resources and things do not exist, but he has a knowledge, but that knowledge is no longer usable, because in the new context that doesn't serve any purpose, because it has no link with the kind of resources or the kind of nature that surrounds them, based on which they eke out their livelihoods. it means that how a knowledge which served the people for generations disappears, how it gives way to new ones is also an important aspect that we need to keep in mind. Because if a knowledge is disappearing, that means there must be some factors that are responsible for its disappearance, and it doesn't mean that once it disappears, nothing, there is a vacuum there. The new kinds of knowledge develops, and that is what is important for the community to sustain, the culture to sustain, the languages to sustain. So cultural knowledge, when I'm talking about, is actually a resource. It is a resource for the people because they draw from the cultural knowledge and manage their lives. And that is embodied in through a language that is passed on. And that is what actually helps them to do what they are doing or what they are supposed to do. It is a guide to action. That's why I call it as cultural knowledge, not only a resource, but also guide to action. What people do is based on that. So it is also important for them to manage a very harmonious kind of existence along with the nature, because the traditional, the indigenous communities never consider themselves as the only creation, but they are part of the creation. And like any other creature, they are also creatures created by the nature. So therefore, they don't have a sole right of the nature, but that's why they wanted to have harmonious living with the nature and all other beings of nature. So in other words, cultural knowledge is also related to their livelihoods. It is also related to their resources. It is also related to the language. And it also has this aspect of harmonious way of living with the nature. That means it is an embodiment of all this. And that is where I would call cultural knowledge as an embodiment of multiple systems which are important for sustainability. It is not just one knowledge, it's systems of knowledge it links. So it is linked to practices, it is linked to beliefs, it is linked to even social and cultural systems, part of social and cultural systems. And in other words, if we want to dismantle such kind of a knowledge, we cannot expect that dismantling not having any bearing on the communities or their languages and environment. So that means the moment a cultural knowledge is destroyed, it certainly affects seriously the communities, their languages and environment. And so in other words, we must remember that indigenous communities are basically, I'm talking about largely, they are multicultural, multilingual. In fact, this applies to even to many of the nomadic communities. Each nomadic community speaks not less than 3-4 languages. In fact, some of the indigenous communities, they are living in a multiple indigenous community societies. Each one deals with themselves within with their language, but with others they deal with them in their languages, or mutually there is a kind of understanding. So indigenous communities are basically multicultural and multilingual, and that means that they also respect the knowledge and language of others. So this is what is lacking with regard to the dominant languages and dominant cultures. That means they want the coexistence of other communities of users of natural resources. And that is where in fact, there are studies made by scholars, they say that how different communities living in the same resource area use the resources in different ways without depleting the resources. In other words, there is a kind of coexistence of other communities of users without affecting their harmonious living. So in other words, knowledge and resources are communally also owned, and it's not owned by individual or private property. And that is where we must understand if we are looking at the linkage between cultural knowledge and language. It is important for us to keep in mind that knowledge is a power and language is also a power. So threat to cultural knowledge is also threat to speech community. This is what I've been talking about. are imposing the knowledge and language of the dominant communities over the native speakers. So what it leads to is basically, since it is a power relationship, they get subjugated, or they get subordinated, and they lose their identity. So if you are imposing the dominant languages or the knowledge in dominant language and dominant knowledge over the indigenous communities or the minority language groups, then that leads to the subjugation, subordination, and loss of identity to these language groups or speech communities. So what it does is, it actually threatens the very existence of the language, threatens the knowledge and culture. Therefore, I would call that it leads to genocide of their languages, genocide of knowledge, and genocide of culture. So, in fact, what is important here is, since the state is also dominated by the dominant power groups or the dominant language groups, so the policies of the state also accelerates these processes of decline of the language communities, decline of knowledge of these communities, and cultural existence of these communities. So, in other words, what happens is, the policies of the state further accelerate these processes of, I would call them as a genocide of languages, knowledge, and culture. This is not just the genocide of the language, culture, and knowledge. It is also disastrous for the natural resources, because the natural resources conserved by the indigenous communities based on their knowledge, because the conservation of the resources are important for them, for their existence, for their survival, and for their continuance. So therefore, that has a serious ramifications even for the resources that are to be conserved. Now, the knowledge and diversity, if you look at it, that's what I was talking about. The knowledge and language are basically related to a particular region, related to a culture, particular specific culture. I may have, even if it is a dominant language, the accent or even the variations in that speech communities are related to the local, cultural and or regional aspects. So language, therefore, the idioms that are used for different things in a given speech community, in a given region, they are important aspect in the transfer of heritage of a cultural knowledge. That means they have specific words, specific meanings, which are not expressible in any other manner. Therefore, it plays an important role in the transfer of cultural heritage or cultural knowledge. So it means that if a language is dead, it is also death of if the knowledge is dead, it is also the death of the language and the speech community, because slowly they get integrated with the larger groups. In fact, there are quite a few cases in India, especially there is a huge indigenous community called Chenchus. They are hunter-gatherers. They are basically spread between the Telugu-speaking states of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and they had once their language. Now they don't have that language. They only speak Telugu. So that also has ramifications for their knowledge. Now knowledge is also, because they are excellent in gathering honey, and there are different varieties of honey and techniques of hunting, and also ethno-medical knowledge. All that is missing now. And so therefore, what we find is language and culture of the indigenous communities are basically inclusive in their expressions. And in fact, am I not audible? Hello?
Excuse me. Sorry. Just so with a mistake it came. So I'll just interact after the presentation.
I just thought I'm not audible. So language and culture are, because there is a difference between the dominant languages and dominant cultures. Between the indigenous language and English culture. Indigenous language and indigenous cultures are basically inclusive. They are expressive of inclusion. They are not expressive of exclusions. Because they are also basically, as I was talking about, they're communitarian, they own resources collectively. Therefore, any abuse of collective ownership is not tolerated, because there are norms and things which are interwoven in the cultural setting itself. That's because if they do anything, because there are certain, for example, a particular fruit cannot be eaten before a particular ritual is conducted, because at that time of the ritual, the fruit comes to a kind of fruition. And that is only, otherwise, if they eat, then it can cause health problems, or they want to say. In other words, there are regulations. That's where they do not wantonly abuse the nature. Therefore, because the cultural settings and even in the language that they express, these are very clearly, because idiomatically also they're expressed. So, in fact, in this context, I wanted to raise one thing, is that we always talk of knowledge societies in today's context. Now, if we are talking about knowledge societies, all these are knowledge societies, then are the indigenous societies are not knowledge societies? Because indigenous societies are more pluralistic, more inclusive compared to the dominant language. So we need to think of these kinds of ideas that we have. So indigenous cultures or indigenous languages or knowledge systems, they have sustained themselves over centuries. And now we find, especially after the colonial administration or colonial rule, and even the post-colonial national governments, their attitude towards them and attitude towards the resources are responsible for this. I would call the so-called development, which is initiated by these colonialists and subsequent national governments, are responsible for the displacement, domination, or subjugation of these cultures and their languages. In fact, they are never given importance at all. So most of the nomadic and indigenous communities, in fact, they we can, if we wanted to digitize them, we need to use them in a participatory manner. So the moot question is whether, because this is where my entire discussion comes, whether to develop a distinct script for each language, or to use the script of a dominant language to promote it. Because developing a script and then digitizing all that takes a little longer. One can do it simultaneously. But in the meanwhile, how do we, because otherwise they'll fast disappear. We know many of the languages are virtually became extinct. In fact, in Andaman Islands, there's a language called Go. The last speaker was dead in 2010 or something, and that is the end of that language itself. This is happening with many other languages. So, we need to, this is the point of my discussion today. So, we have two alternatives with regard to promoting indigenous languages. One is developing a unique script for the indigenous and minority languages, which can be converted into Unicode or put into Unicode. And the other one is, because they don't have a script, it is not easier to develop script, in such a quick manner. Even if we put in for so many indigenous languages, it's not that easier to develop for that many languages. Even small communities, speech communities, which are less than, say, about 5,000-6,000 members. How do we, because they become a kind of issue for neglect. So therefore, these are two approaches that are there for us. One is having a unique script, and another not having a script but using dominant languages to promote indigenous languages and education of the people in their languages. Because, of course, it is important to learn as to how each of these approaches played out in India. I'm taking examples in India in promoting and protecting indigenous languages. And because these two are two different implications. In fact, in the first one, you find if they have independent script, you have that language gets independent identity. Community gets identity, and its identity gets reinforced through the language or the script. It also helps them to preserve their cultural knowledge. So now this is the advantage of having script. The second one where if they don't have the script, but still the children can be taught in their native indigenous language using the script of a dominant language of the nation. The reason why I'm saying this is being done in the states of Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, where Andhra Pradesh, when I'm talking about including the Telangana, Telugu speaking state Telangana, which is bifurcated in 2014. And it is here what we need to understand is because there are efforts by these governments using the state language, script of the state language for the indigenous communities or what they're called as Adivasis. Their languages are their language, unwritten languages are spoken in Telugu or Odia or whichever the state language or in Hindi in some places. Now, which means it helps the children to learn the dominant script, which ultimately they have to learn after certain classes, elementary classes. So, which means they learn the script. By the time they acclimatize with because when they grow, they also intermingle with others and then they might become, the script becomes easier for them. Then reading becomes easier and then possibly it helps them. That's what they have been arguing in adopting the dominant language script. It doesn't mean we should neglect to develop the script, independent script for them. But till such time, the children should be given education in their mother tongue. Because I'll give you a small example. I made a study on child labor. It was way back in 2000. There, it is between two communities. One is what we call a scheduled caste, which is called locally now it's Dalit communities, and the other one is the Banjara or Lambada community, which is treated in Andhra Pradesh as scheduled caste, scheduled tribe. It's a indigenous community, but basically they are nomadic earlier, and the children speak, or the parents and everybody speaks only their language called Dorboli. Dorboli is one doesn't have script, and but the children when they attend the school, they just don't understand what is going on in the class because the teachers do not know their language, and they talk in Telugu, and children like good artists, they copy what is there on the board and then reproduce the same thing. So because there is automatic kind of movement of children to class 5. Once they come to class 6, they are zero because they don't know the language. They may have picked up the script, but they are not understood because the basic concepts are never understood. So there were efforts. In fact, I was involved in one project by some people from Mahbubnagar. They were teachers. They wanted to teach in the Lambada because the dominant language there, local language, because they are not a dominant script or dominant culture, because they're part of the larger community, but they're substantial speakers of the community. But they don't understand the classes. So these people have developed some primers. I asked them, why don't you use the state language script and try and do that? And they did experiment. And the children concepts were understood better, and that helped partly. But then it did not succeed because of lack of patronage. And this is where we must understand there are two it has implications of different kinds that we find here. One is if we are using the dominant language script or the state language script, then immediate and urgent recourse to preserve and promote the unwritten languages or oral cultures becomes an important need, because historically they were neglected, and at least now we should be in a position to preserve their culture, their language, their idioms, so that it becomes important for them to learn about themselves, learn about concepts in the formal education. So one can adopt the script if they are available. In fact, in the case of Santals and also among the Savaras, which I will be talking a little later, there are scripts available, and they are getting. In fact, Santali language is added to the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution of language. There are about 22 languages, and it is one of them. So it is only indigenous language which is added there, but not me. Though there are large groups out there like the Goms who have Gondi language. In fact, recently they found the script existed in the past, the script is no longer used, but they are trying to bring it back. So many researchers are putting their efforts to develop scripts for many of these indigenous and minority languages. And they have also developed, some of them have developed bilingual dictionaries, like English to Savara or English to Santhal. So what is important here is active participation of community members and the local government becomes an important aspect, because sorry. Without that, you cannot do anything for preserving the minority languages. In fact, why I'm saying this, government's participation is important. In fact, if you look at the policies and programs of the governments earlier, had a negative effect on the indigenous languages, and in fact, many of them have even become endangered. Many have already lost the whole race. I'll give you one example. In India, the census operations from 1971 onwards, they have decided, because it is said that any language which has speakers less than 10,000 is endangered. And paradoxically, earlier they were enlisting all these languages. After 71, any language spoken by less than 10,000 speakers are not counted. So it has really affected the indigenous language. Almost 99 indigenous languages and dialects of there earlier are almost lost. In fact, many of them are endangered now. You see, this is also important because there are realizing some of these problems. There were legislation, there were kind of programs adopted by the government of India right from 2000 onwards, or even earlier to that. It was there under the national education policies of the 1986, and they have devised acts like Right to Education Act. Right to Education, a child has a right, but then they only have a paper, but it doesn't really translate into reality. There are a lot of problems, a lot of discussions about it. And the other one was Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Under this, the government of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh and some other governments have started imparting education in the tribal languages or indigenous languages in those areas, because there are substantial indigenous communities exist in Odisha and parts of Andhra. So these are like the new education policy of 2020 insists that education, early education, has to be in the mother tongue. So this has some, there is some hope to promote education in the mother tongue of the indigenous communities. And now let me, I will not take much longer. If you really look at some kind of a background, uh, the history of scripts for the indigenous languages in India. In fact, right from 1930s and 40s, there were efforts made to develop scripts for some of the indigenous languages. Mostly, they are the languages of the larger tribal communities. Like one of the important examples is Pandit Raghunath Murmu. He's developed Old Chiki, or it's also called Ulsana script for the Santals. This is the only language because of the movement and the pressure on the government. This was included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. There is another scholar, is one of the doyens of Telugu speakers, especially to protect the languages. He tried to work among the Savara, which are a tribe existing on both sides of the borders of Andhra Pradesh and Odisha. And he has developed script and also developed a bilingual dictionary, English to Saura to English, and also a manual of the Saura language. These are published by the Mithal publication. Of course, most important one is the Bangay Domango's Sorang Sompen script. In fact, this is added to the Unicode, and in fact, we have one presentation made by Sony earlier to us, and she had also been making very serious efforts to digitalize the language, and which is very laudable. And for the Saura, they're all also called as Saura or Savara, etc. They're different, like they're spread in different states of the country. And in the recent past, if you will look at it, there are researchers who have developed scripts for indigenous languages in different states of India. We have an example from Arunachal Pradesh, Lakhum Masang. Lakhum Masang actually is developed a script for the Tangsa tribe, which is considered an endangered community in Arunachal Pradesh. And he passed away in 2019 when he completed the task. But that was further taken up because he's developed a script, and that was further taken up by Wanglum Wasang, because he is basically a farmer, a peasant, but he was impressed by this kind of thing, and then he's spreading among the many tribes of Assam there, especially the Tangsa community. And similarly, you will find Banwang Losu, he has developed a script for Wanchu language. And another important kind of thing that there are 10 indigenous languages for which script was developed by Professor Rasnasri of Andhra University Department of English. She has developed for all the tribes that live in the entire combined state of Andhra Pradesh, including Gonds, Polamis, and the others like Bhagata and many other border between Odisha and Andhra Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh and Chhattisgarh states. In other words, these are efforts that are happening to develop independent scripts for these communities. And we must appreciate their efforts because many of them are now slowly getting Unicode. Efforts are there to develop Unicode into that, convert them into Unicode, and also digitalize their languages. In fact, there is a state-sponsored Kerala. It's called Kerala Institute of Research and Training among the training and the development of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in Kerala. That's called KITTAS. They are making efforts to develop 30 scripts for the 37 Adivasi languages or indigenous languages. Similar efforts are also there for the indigenous communities in Assam, Nagaland, the northeast states, and many others. In fact, I have made a small clipping. I will not play it because it's a news item that's there, it has come. The Andhra Pradesh government is promoting teaching in several languages in their script, not in the dominant script. But there are some from the community who argue that if they also use what is called Adivasi Odia, Telugu is written, if they also use that, it will be beneficial to for them to switch over to larger system. But the efforts are there. In fact, maybe at the end, if there is a time, I can play that a bit, just to show the involvement of the community and the involvement of the government in promoting it. So, multilingual teaching in mother tongue of the indigenous communities by the governments of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh under Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, as I mentioned earlier, and also in the recent National Education Policy 2020 is very important because they are trying to impart, because they have already developed some primers in the elementary level in the dominant in the level of the indigenous languages, and but using, except for sometimes where they use Polichiki script in Odisha, because sometimes are spread across 3-4 states of India. It's a large group, and but that apart from the other group for which the main script is used is the Savara language, but otherwise all others, the dominant state languages, Odisha and Odia, and in Andhra Pradesh, which is Telugu, is used. That is, they write everything, the oral languages in the dominant state, but imparting education in their mother tongue. So, these kind of efforts are also there in northeastern states and some of the other states like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, and importantly, the dominant language script is used to be adopted because it is at least it helps them to impart education in their language. In fact, what is significant in this is both in Odisha and Andhra Pradesh, but also elsewhere, many of the non-governmental organizations are putting very serious effort in promoting, education in the indigenous languages. Let's hope that indigenous language and dialects will be saved for the post. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siva. This was amazing again.
If there is little time, I can play the clipping.
Sorry?
Otherwise, I have given in my PowerPoint, and slide 19, there is a YouTube link that can be seen by anybody else later.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I will put it, if you can put it in the chat, we have a question by text.
Yeah.
Hi. This was a really great talk, very thought-provoking. So first I want to thank you. But also I have a couple of questions. One, when you talk about language and knowledge, and you make a connection with it being closely connected with management of resources, and it seems to me maybe a very naive view of indigenous communities that language is so closely connected with their survival in their environment. We have many examples of knowledge today which I question the usefulness. Pass along fables that we tell children, um, maybe lots of examples of stories of maybe with religious connection or otherwise, but even things like the story of the constellations and the background of constellations, which every culture has, but really doesn't serve that much purpose in terms of survival, especially not today. So a lot of that information comes forward. So I want to one question: how closely connected that information is, that guideline is that you offer. But the other thing, in terms of expressing a language today in the dominant script, I wonder if we don't lose some part of the culture is lost when you lose whatever their writing system is and force it into the constraints of the dominant language. So, for when we talk about, let's say, Chinese characters, there's some origin in how the characters are composed and written, which is also a part of the culture. To express that in Latin characters, you would lose that. And maybe even for some of the languages today that have a script with no spaces in between words, if you change that and put it into a Latin script, and now you impose rules like how punctuation is added, or even spaces between words if you aren't losing something about the culture, or maybe even introducing ideas into the culture that don't exist. So those are the 2 points I wanted to understand. But I thought it's a really great talk. Lots of ideas in there that are very thought-provoking. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. You are very right. Because what happens is certain expressions or certain tonal kind of voice intonations, all that cannot be written in the other language because the script is not there. But then there are some kind of, because if they are written by the natives, that is, I'm talking about indigenous communities, if they are using temporarily the dominant script, they have some kind of way in which they try to express. Because, for example, in Tamil and French, la is used. Chalian we say, we don't have that kind of a writing, but we still add some kind of things and express it. So there are disadvantages, but immediate requirement is to keep those languages alive. Immediate requirement is to impart education in their language. Till such time they have their own script or efforts are on, and that will help. I understand because there are definitely serious problems in certain expressions, certain kind of things, but at least some part of the knowledge is surviving. The language, the way it's spoken, people understand when they're taught in their mother tongue. And that is where because that is what they are doing it right now, and simultaneously people are trying to develop scripts. So those who are familiar with the language are in a better position to do that. So which means if they are educated, some of the indigenous communities, then they will be in a better position to work with the others to develop certain terminologies which are used by others into this or their words into other languages. It's a tougher thing because there are bilingual dictionaries also developed. Of course, they are using script of the dominant language, but the way in which the meanings and things are expressed in English or other languages that described. In other words, there are difficulties. I agree with you because the script, certain scripts are more easily adaptable. Like for example, the Telugu script, there are certain words which have disappeared now, are not used, but in the past, those kind of intonations or the tonal expressions were there. So some of them are brought back. So there are issues, but then our immediate concern is how to sustain communities. That's what I've been trying to emphasize. I appreciate your question because both are relevant and both have significance because you can't express certain things in other languages, both in terms of expression as well as in terms of meanings.
Yeah, the funny thing is, even today, all of our languages, no matter what language we speak, are being changed by the fact that we're using digital communications. It drives me nuts when I hear somebody say out loud in a conversation, LOL. I'm going, just laugh if you're going to laugh, right? So, anyway, I'll let others comment. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Yes, please, Hidayah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot to Dr. Siva Prasad Garu. So, that's a good, beautiful presentation. So, I want to share some of my observations and concerns and experiences. It's good that it's developing a script and all those things that has one role to play. I'm working in couple of languages. My mother tongue is Telugu, and I'm working on Koya and Gondi dialects also, especially in developing children's literature. So I was part of the standardization of Gondi dictionary, which was actually it's a huge effort, which was initiated by Subramshu Chaudhary of CGNet Swara, and Gond elders and educated people from multiple states were participating in it, and they were actually into standardization of Gondi dictionary kind of a thing. Because as all of us know, Gonds is a larger ethnic community. They spread over 6 states in India. So Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Andhra, Telangana, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, even part of Bengal, so many other things, right? And part of Gujarat also. Right? So in my participation, I was able to observe that, okay, if you just go by recording in an alphabetical order, you will get a limited vocabulary. Unless you go horizontally and vertically, like agriculture, fishing, hunting, the language used in various contexts, there are hundreds of subjects. It's a huge thing to record also. Because when you said, these people were divided into groups, and there were 5-6 groups working at different things. Again, an alphabetical thing. So, we were able to bring out a limited dictionary. So, this is a challenge. Because even in agriculture, there are different kinds of agriculture. The zoom and this shifting agriculture is there, which we call Podu, and this. And for paddy, you do different things, and for millets, you do differently. And even rituals and other things, you get different vocabulary. Unless all these cultural things, basically, I see language around sort of production and reproduction also around. So, unless these things are addressed, so how do we get the language recorded? So, just 20 years back, I was sitting with 8 to 10-year-old children were just recording something. So children were able to come out with 100 names for fishes and birds and all things which this. The same children, if I see, or with that much vocabulary. So how do we take up these challenges and go ahead? That's my concern.
Yeah, I think it's an important one because that's where I said they are not one knowledge system but knowledge systems. There are multiple kind of areas that all of them need to be taken into consideration. In fact, in cognitive anthropology, they use the different approach. That is, they try to use the idioms of the locals and then try to understand, because the way they categorize, the way they classify things in the environment are important. Like, I may use only 2-3 names for a bird or a group of birds, but the local culture they may use hundreds of names depending on their knowledge systems and depending on their usage and their value. In other words, there are variations that we need to capture that, and that's what I'm saying. Even if we are allowing them to write in the dominant language script, they can develop for themselves. There are people, scholars from the indigenous communities, they can put their heads together and with the help of others, they can do it. But script development takes longer time. So till such time, at least the knowledge that exists should not disappear. The kind of things that guide them, that help them, should not disappear. That is what I'm saying. In fact, what you are saying is very true, because I know a couple of other friends also who are working on the Gondi and other languages. It is a big task. It's not a smaller kind of an enterprise. So it requires coordination. It requires a collaboration of many people, diverse kinds of people, diverse kinds of people from different disciplinary backgrounds. In fact, they have philosophical thoughts. Even those working about that, you see, it's not simply religious. It's not simply religious. It's something philosophical thought, way of life, the way they think of things. All these are people have worked on some of them, but it requires vigorous effort. I agree with you, because this is not easier. Because if it had been easier, things would have been better today. Because it's not easier, because there was a neglect of at least 200-300 years minimum. So it's not easier to fill it up in such a short period. Thank you.
Yeah. I agree with. Just only this thing is, for example, okay, so developing script, as I'm saying in the field, for example, if you take a word for the mother, in Adilabad they say Bai, and if you come to Bhadrachalam, Yava, and if you go to Chhattisgarh, Yayo, and if you say that for, how can we standardize a word for mother in Gondi? There are multiple words, and if you go deeper into Chhattisgarh, they have another word, right? So even for a single word, there are multiple words. What I mean to actually say, add this, or maybe bring this to your notice is, for everything there is multiple words. All these dialects need to be actually safeguarded. In the name of standardization, somewhere we kill the local dialects also.
I agree with you. But this is what I was telling, because even if you take Telugu, for example, Telugu spoken in one area is understood differently in another area.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is what I said. Even every 150, not even some 10-15 miles even, you have changes in usage of the words. So it is that's why I was calling it as regional and local. Language and culture are regional and local. So if somebody is writing for the local thing, they can do it. But larger kind of, it's like a compendium, you have to do it later. But it is possible to standardize. Even standardizing Telugu has problems. Dominant language has a problem. Because, for example, in Odisha, Sambalpuriya is different from other areas. Same is case with Bengal. Same is case with Marathi. Same is the case with Kannada or any other language. So that is part of I think linguists are the better person to explain that why that's because what we call Mandalika, they are varied.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Julie has her hand up.
Yes. Thank you very much, Siva. I loved your presentation. I especially appreciated that you talked about the importance of the knowledge systems. Some of us joined the group, the planning group for the North America, oh gosh, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it has to do with the planning for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And the Indigenous groups that participated, that's what they talked about. They talked about the knowledge systems and the values. It's not just necessarily about farming, but yes, you need fishing, farming, all that, but the value systems. How do we treat each other?
Yeah.
How do we protect the environment, and why do we care? I mean, these things are encoded in the language. They're encoded in stories. They're encoded in expressions. They're very much encoded in the language. So I love that you talked about that. But my question, and forgive me if maybe you said this and I didn't quite catch it, but I'm curious about a situation where you have a minority language and they have this problem before them, like they want to digitize, and they have a historical script, but they also could otherwise choose to use a dominant script, but their territory actually spans two different areas, or more than one area of the dominant script. So let's say it goes from the Telugu area into Kannada area. Do you know, or any other area, do you know of an example of what decision they made? How is that working out for them?
Yeah, but this is what was done by a lot of NGOs who have been working in Odisha, because quite a few names are there, and also in Telugu-speaking states, and also elsewhere, like in Kerala, we have some examples. And you are true, you are right, because what happens is the decisions with regard to the communities are possibly taken because of the pressure of the NGOs and other educationists, saying that the children, because this is another thing what we notice is the literacy rates are very low among the indigenous communities from the formal education model. And because, first of all, there is a lot of dropout, they don't understand what is taught in the process is unrelated, because if they are talking about the national leaders, how does it matter to them? They just do not know who is Gandhi, who is Nehru, who is Modi, or anybody in the global area. What they know is their culture, their dominant groups, their movements, their nature, their culture, their values, their outcomes. That's what they are interested in. So if somebody is teaching, because the pedagogical aspects are very important, the curriculum is important. So people are trying to work on those issues, and it is that's what I'm saying. It's a historical neglect of centuries, and we cannot quickly erase it overnight or develop like magic. We can't do that. It takes time, but at least there is some kind of intent. I hope that intent translates into real survival of the languages. But if there are, you see, what we find is, if the script is available, they are promoting in that script. Because
you mean, I'm sorry, you mean if the script is available, if that community has a historical script, they're going to try to use that one to create educational materials in that one. But then, as you mentioned before, the burden on the school children, if they're going to learn their historical script, they'll also learn the dominant one.
This is the problem, because first of all, if somebody in 1930s and 1940s, people have developed a script, and to teachers first have to learn the script, to teach the script. It's not easy, because if I have to learn, it's like, at least now we have technology and techniques. If somebody goes to Russia and or to Germany, you have to write in the local languages. Within 1 year you are trained. So you need to train the teachers about the cultures, about the communities, about the language, the script, everything. Even to teach, to handle children, tribal children, or the indigenous community children, or minority community children, you need to understand them better. So these are all problems they are encountering. They are trying to at least go step by step. But it's not easy. It's a very tough thing to do.
Yeah. So it sounds like in most cases, what you're saying is that if the region of the minority language spans two different dominant script areas, that they would likely use their historical script, and the children would learn, in this region they learn the Telugu script and their historical, and in this region they learn a Kannada script.
That is what is happening, because in Odisha they write in Odia language. In Andhra they write in Telugu language, but it is in their mother tongue. The script, if they don't have, if they have common script, they use the common script.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic concepts. I am still, processing the multilingualism because, it was always evident that, they will speak the dominant regional, language. But what I had not realized was that they speak all the languages of the region as well. And just a comment here, being Greek, I have learned a lot of the Greek history. And one of the eras that not much is known about is the Byzantine Empire era, the East Roman era. And at that time, Greek was the lingua franca of the world. And what amazed me to learn when I was still, in high school, was that everybody was multilingual. Everybody spoke all the dialects, all the languages. Greeks would speak Arabic and Latin and everything else. And I thought we lost it. But obviously, we haven't, because, the indigenous communities are still on that multilingualism, with their fellow and neighboring communities. So that I'm still, processing.
That is really a thing that the dominant languages and dominants have to adopt that approach.
Yeah. Sue Ellen has her hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add to what you were talking about, the Greeks speaking multiple dialects and multiple languages. If you read Umberto Eco, I'm particularly thinking about Queen Luana, but there are other or just any number of his books where people are speaking a huge variety of dialects in northern Italy or in parts of Italy or parts of Europe. And in Germany, of course, we have many dialects, but we don't speak the other guy's dialect. We speak High German and we speak the local dialect. We maybe understand neighboring dialects, but we don't speak them. But we speak English too.
In fact, after the social media and others came, at least there is emergence of the regional and other languages. Otherwise, the dominant languages were bulldozing, even like English or maybe French and German and Portuguese. They have virtually, subsumed all others. They just wiped them out many places. So that at least is now coming back. In social media, people write, they use English, script to express themselves, or they use the local dominant languages. They know the script. They write. At least that is taking place. So one that's a positive thing. There are also many negative things that are happening.
Yes, of course, of course.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions or comments? I am still processing. I need to go back and, look at some of these things. Like Julie, the knowledge systems. This is something that we've already knew about, but realizing that how tight the connection is with the language is also very, very important. And thank you for sharing some, real life examples from the Indian languages. And
there's a lot of literature on this, but then I think as examples that will serve the purpose.
Yeah. May I suggest that since we have another 5-10 minutes, that we play the video?
I'll do that.
Yeah.
I hope I will be able to share that. Shall I send it to you? I can make a page. Does it show? I just
put it. Do you want to share your screen too?
I'll share the screen.
And for whoever wants to copy the link to watch it again later. No, we don't see your screen. Okay.
I don't think I'm able to.
Okay.
Just give the link, and whoever is interested, actually they can actually see it.
Basically, what they are showing is how they are imparting in overall language. Their script, they are trying to teach. This is at least they are using the script available in the community, because that cuts across the states. So that's what the example is. It's a news item. Maybe that link is there. You can just see language, maybe Telugu, but the content you can understand. I found it very interesting because at least there is an effort by the government to promote education in the modern time.
Great. Thank you so much, Siva. And for everybody interested, the link is in the chat. Please click on it now so you can open it in another tab. Otherwise, it's going to go.
One last thought, if I may. So one of the advantages that I have heard about on social media, text messaging and using Facebook or whatever the social media, I know there's a lot of problems with that. But the interesting thing is that it is capturing a lot of language usage, and interestingly, informal, which is very important too. Informal language usage of a lot of languages, even if they are using a script that is not ideal, and they're doing something to make it work, but at least it's capturing language data.
Right.
So that's a unintended, unforeseen benefit from social media.
You're very right. You're very right. In fact, there are people now trying to work through that because that data one can use even if because I find many of these groups they post mails to me. They post in the WhatsApp groups, and I find it very interesting because they are trying to keep their language alive.
Yeah.
Whatever it means.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is because they are able to communicate better amongst themselves.
Well, and an added point, which I think this is important. This came up in those talks that we listened to the communities who participated in the planning of the decade. When you have the ability to send text messages in your native language, what ends up happening is that the children or the younger generation who are very connected to their devices, very connected to their phone, very on top of that phone, sending messages to their grandparents in their native language. What a fantastic way to support the language, because as soon as you lose that youngest generation, then it's going to be what, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years and the language is gone. So I just thought that was another interesting aspect of social media and just the ability to send text messages. And hopefully they can do it in a really good script. But I guess it's happening, even with not ideal scripts.
So they invent ways to keep their language alive.
Yeah, using an extra diacritic or something. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great presentation. Thank you so much, Siva.
I must thank all of you because you contributed to it in different ways. Not only today, but thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You've raised your hand. You want to say something?
Yeah, it's a great presentation. Only one thing is needed to be actually added and is, as I was suggesting. So, going horizontally and vertically and I don't know, recording every kind of living systems and non-living systems and entire socio-cultural ecosystems and huge, a great lot of thing need to be done. So I think how do we go about that is the concern of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Good to see you.